Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's workshop. Today's workshop is the global economy at a crossroads, U.S.-China in focus. And I am Grace Yu, the board chair of the 1990 Institute. In today's workshop, we are diving into one of the world's most fascinating and complicated relationships, the economic relationship between the United States and China. This is an ongoing story with big personalities, high-stakes decisions, and a little global economic drama. Think of it as a part history lesson, part business strategy session, and part political thrillers. Basically, the script for a blockbuster movie, except it is a documentary and we are living in it real time. But beyond the headlines, these global decisions aren't just abstract. They have a direct impact on our future, shaping the world of our students who will navigate in it. And I want to give a special thanks to the sponsors that are supporting our program and for amplifying the webinar. In addition, I would like to acknowledge the support from the Henry Luce Foundation. This workshop is funded in part by a grant from the Luce Foundation. And to help us unravel the complexity of our topics today, we have an incredible panel of experts. We have Andy Rothman as our speaker. Andy is an expert on China's economy with decades of experience in government and in private sector, a former U.S. diplomat in China and an investment strategist. Andy has a unique ability to break down China's economic shifts for business, policymakers, and educators alike. And next up after Andy is Dr. Yuanyuan An. Dr. An is a leading scholar on political economy and China's development. She is the author of China's Gilded Age, which redefines how we think about corruptions and economic growth. Her recent 7-part video series on the economics of China is an invaluable resource. In guiding our discussion today is Clay Dubie, Director Emeritus of the U.S.-China Institute. Clay has spent years studying, teaching, and explaining China's evolving role in the world with clarity and insight. He is also a longtime collaborator of 1990 Institute's Teachers Workshop. We're very fortunate to have Clay to guide us through today's workshop's discussions. Before we begin, there's a factoid for your next trivia competition. Believe it or not, unbeknownst to each other, Andy and Clay were at the same music concert in China in 1985, featuring the British group Wham!, a rare moment of cultural exchange at the time. If music can't break barriers, what else can? But that's a topic for another workshop. Now let's begin. And here's our agenda for the workshop. And please know that there is a switch in the sequence. Andy Rothman will come up first and followed by Dr. Yuanyuan An, and then followed by panel discussion led by Clay Dubie.
Okay, thanks, Grace. If I had known I was going to get that kind of introduction, I would have brought some Wham music along to start the presentation. So I want to offer some ideas about how to think about China, which right now involves getting inside the thought processes of Xi Jinping and Donald Trump. To get started, I want to talk a little bit about my background because that gives you a sense of where my perspective comes from. The slide on the upper left-hand side here is from my first trip to China as a student in 1980. And the photograph below shows how I got into China. Back then, there were no direct flights from the United States. There wasn't even a direct train from Hong Kong. We had to get off the train at the Hong Kong border in Lo Wu with the mainland and carry our luggage across through this little tunnel on the bridge there. On the upper right-hand side, this was one of the main shopping streets in Guangzhou in 1984 when I lived there as a very junior American diplomat. So you can see, compared to the photograph on the bottom right there, that's Guangzhou these days at night. It's just an enormous change. Back then, people in China were so poor that they hoped when their relatives came to visit from Hong Kong or Taiwan, they would bring them things like an electric fan, a bicycle, because those were things they couldn't afford in China or they were in short supply. Having lived through this several decades of incredible growth is probably one of the reasons why what I'm going to talk about today might sound a little bit more optimistic than what you often hear about China. When we hear the names of some prominent Chinese companies these days, it gives you a good sense of what people's reactions are and how they think about it. So maybe ZTE and Huawei are not companies you're familiar with, but I'm sure you've heard of TikTok and DeepSeek. And what I've been amused to find is that there's often kind of a knee-jerk reaction to these companies of either, wow, it's quite incredible what China's been able to do with technology, or I can't believe they're not really doing that, or it's a threat to the United States. And when DeepSeek became a big news item in January, it kind of reminded me of a Sputnik moment, but I was disappointed in the response that the US government gave to this, because if you think back to 1957 when Sputnik was launched, the response of the Republican administration, the Eisenhower administration, then was to really double down on US spending on education, on basic science, to try and catch up to what the Soviets were doing at that time. Whereas, unfortunately, I think right now the focus is more on how do we stop China from doing more. And so when I think about the people who are worried about TikTok and DeepSeek as a threat to our way of life, I'm much more worried about the last chart on the bottom right here, which is that only about 1/3 of Americans believe that US democracy is successful today. One of the important misconceptions right now is that we helped bring China into the global world, the global institutions like the WTO, and it hasn't been beneficial for us. And what this chart hopefully illustrates is that, in fact, engagement with the Chinese government, Chinese people, Chinese companies has actually been really good for most Americans. The bars here show you that since China joined the WTO a couple of decades ago, US exports to China are up 646%, whereas to the rest of the world, they're up 171%. US agricultural exports to China have increased by 1,200% to China over that time versus 174% to the rest of the world. So for many companies, many workers, this has been really good. And during the same period of time, imports from China have come in. And while it's created competition, it's actually been really good. If you look at studies by academics, by the Federal Reserve Bank, you can see the general conclusion is that imports from China have kept inflation low, especially for working class families who tend to spend a higher percentage of their disposable income on tradable goods. So overall, I think it's clear that WTO membership has supported American exports and jobs, as well as been good for most American consumers. Another thing that's important to consider is that bringing China into the global infrastructure that the US and the UK created after World War II has been really good for over 1 billion Chinese people. When I first started working in China back in Guangzhou in the early 80s, there were no private companies at all. You couldn't even find a privately run restaurant. Everybody worked for the state. And at that point in time, the state or the Communist Party controlled people's lives almost all day, every day. They told you where to go to school, what to study. When you graduated, they assigned you to a job. That gave you your state-controlled housing. You needed a chit from the government to get a train ticket to go to the next place. To leave the country was really, really difficult. Even to get married, you had to get your work unit's approval. Now, all those things I just described are gone, especially the market forces at work. So as I said, when I first worked in China, there were no private companies. Now you can see here that about 90% of urban employment in China is small, entrepreneurial, privately owned companies, just like private companies here in the United States. And these are the companies that generate all the new jobs in China, all the innovation. If we think about companies like DeepSeek, other AI companies, battery companies, EV companies, they're almost entirely privately owned companies that are, if you get to know the owners and the founders, really similar to what we see driving growth and jobs and innovation in the United States. So I think this has had a really positive impact on personal freedom for most Chinese people. Even though there's no political freedom in China, the expansion in personal freedom is something that I think it's really hard to get your head around if you weren't traveling to China back in the 80s and early 90s when there was no freedom at all. This is an issue that comes up in almost every conversation I have with investors or people who are just interested in China. Is there going to be war across the Taiwan Strait? My view, and part of this it comes from my experience during the mid-1990s when I was the Taiwan desk officer at the State Department, which was the earlier time when China was firing missiles over Taiwan. My view is that Xi Jinping and the Chinese leadership have no desire at all to use force against Taiwan. There's no domestic political pressure. Almost every Chinese person I know already believes that Taiwan is part of China. I think Xi Jinping understands that the military risk would be huge. If anything, the experience of Putin's invasion of Ukraine has made that clear. That was just a simple land border. Here we're talking about 100 miles of really difficult water. There's only a few places on Taiwan that are suitable for an amphibious assault, and everybody knows where they are. The risks of getting bogged down, like Putin has gotten bogged down in Ukraine, are enormous. And I think that's a very strong disincentive for Xi Jinping to think about using force. And then finally, the economic consequences would be disastrous. Russia's not that globally integrated, but China definitely is. China really depends on imports for things like soybeans, iron ore, and also semiconductors. They would be cut off from that. So I think that as long as Washington is pragmatic and continues to have the same policy that the U.S. has had towards Taiwan for many decades now, which is to support a strong, unofficial political and economic relationship with Taiwan, but to be opposed to formal independence in Taiwan unless both Taiwan and China figure out a way to make that work. I think under those circumstances, there are no signs that China intends to use force. So what I'm worried about primarily is the risk of an accident in that water space in there in the Taiwan Strait, which is why it's really important that we try to have a more constructive relationship with China at a military level and a political level to avoid the possibility of an accident or an accident spiraling out of control. But I do not think that a war across the strait is imminent at all. So let's now move to the present day. What does Donald Trump want from his relationship with China, and what does Xi Jinping want in return from that? I think it's difficult to say. When we listen to President Trump, sometimes he talks about his concern about China's role in the U.S. fentanyl crisis. Sometimes he talks about his desire for China to resume buying more things from China. Sometimes he says he wants Chinese companies to invest more in the United States to reduce the trade deficit that way. And on my last trip to China in December, my feeling from talking to people in the Chinese government was what they were really waiting for is for President Trump to make clear what he would really like them to do differently than they're doing today and what he's willing to offer instead. But right now, obviously, we're in a period where everybody's focused on tariffs. Personally, I think the tariff approach is a mistake because my view is that U.S. tariffs on imports from China are going to hurt Americans more than they're going to put pressure on the Chinese government for a couple of reasons. One is China doesn't send that much stuff to the United States relative to all of its exports. What you can see here is that the share of Chinese exports to the G7 countries, that's the most developed countries in the world, including the United States, has fallen from almost half of their exports in 2000 when China joined the WTO to only about a quarter now. And so that's one of the reasons why the impact of U.S. tariffs is not going to be that significant. You can also see that China is no longer an export-led economy. It's not a trade-driven economy. China is increasingly, like the United States, a domestic demand-driven economy. Sorry, I got ahead of myself here. What this slide shows you is that the majority of the countries in the world do more trade with China. Those are the countries highlighted in red, than the countries in blue who do most of their trade, the majority of their trade with the United States. This is a big change over the last couple of decades. And what it illustrates is that China has a lot of other markets to rely on, not just the United States. What this slide illustrates is that trade is a relatively small part of the Chinese economy. Economists talk about net exports when they talk about the trade contribution to an economy. And net exports is a very simple concept. It really means exports minus imports, because GDP is domestic economic growth. And what this shows is that on average, prior to COVID, which led to a lot of disruptions, net exports contributed only about 1% of China's GDP growth. It's been a little bit higher last year, but I think that's unusual. And the main point here is that we're talking about an economy which is primarily driven by domestic demand. And it's also an economy that's less driven by manufacturing. The red line here shows you the contribution to GDP from the tertiary part of China's economy. That's services and construction. So just like the United States, the share of manufacturing jobs in the economy, the contribution of manufacturing to Chinese growth has been declining, while services has been on the rise. And so again, this is one of the reasons, since services are primarily produced and consumed at home, why in my view, the tariffs are not likely to put a lot of pressure on the Chinese government to change policies, to cooperate more on fentanyl, or to do whatever it is that President Trump wants. In fact, if we go back to President Trump's first term in office, he asked the Chinese to cooperate on fentanyl and got a lot of cooperation from China. Basically, the Chinese government stopped the illegal production of fentanyl in the United States, so that in recent years, no fentanyl has been coming into the United States from China. Instead, what's been happening is there are companies producing illegally precursor chemicals for fentanyl, and that's sometimes ending up in Mexico to be made into fentanyl. But what the Chinese government is arguing is that cooperation rather than a trade war is a better way to help China and encourage China to do more on stopping the illegal production in China of precursor chemicals. Now, another topic right now, which is in the news, is how bad is the Chinese economy? Is it collapsing? Would a trade war push it over the edge? Is that something that's in the U.S.'s interest? Well, I think the data shows that the Chinese economy is weaker than it should be, but it's not collapsing. There's some data up on here which you can read. For example, electricity consumption last year, a proxy for industrial activity, was up almost 7% compared to 2023 and was 35% higher than it was in 2019 before COVID. So while China is growing more slowly, the IMF is forecasting that this year and next year, the Chinese economy is going to grow faster than every other major economy in the world except India. And this year and next year, China alone is forecast to account for about 20% of global economic growth. That's a larger share of global growth than from the US and Europe combined. So is that a country that we want to decouple from, have a trade war with? If we think about the consequences for our economy and the global economy, I would argue that that's one of the reasons why a trade war will likely be counterproductive for our economy and also, I think, for our national security. But there are serious problems in China. In my view, the biggest problem is a complete collapse in confidence among Chinese consumers and entrepreneurs because of the chaotic regulatory environment. This is the Chinese government's own consumer confidence index, and you can see that it collapsed during the Shanghai COVID lockdown and has not recovered and remains at historical lows. You can see one of the things that is causing this lack of confidence, which is real slowdown, sharp slowdown in the residential property market in China. So this has meant that there's been a lack of confidence on the part of Chinese people to invest in their own businesses, to hire in their own businesses. And you can see that reflected in the fact that they just save more and more. And so household bank deposits have been rising, where in the blue line, you can see that confidence came back towards the end of the COVID period in the United States, and the size of household bank accounts has come back down again. This was the collapse of the property market in China that I was talking about. This is an example of a volatile and chaotic regulatory environment. The Chinese property market was slowing down, but mistakes by the government in the summer of 2020 led to a collapse. I think that the intention was good. It was an effort to deal with the same kinds of problems that we have in many of our cities in the United States, which is that housing is increasingly unaffordable for the average person, but it was executed in a really bad way. And that has contributed to the loss of confidence and the slowdown in the economy. So how does China fix this? Well, right now, they're in the midst of their annual legislative session, and we're starting to see early signs of what I've been suggesting that the Chinese government needs to do, which is to restore confidence, which is to go back and follow in the footsteps of Deng Xiaoping in 1992. At that point, the Chinese economy was in far worse shape than it is today. And he managed to restore confidence, not by throwing a lot of money at people, but by getting on a train and traveling around southern China, and in every stop, and you can see some of the photos on the bottom of this slide, every stop just persuading the early entrepreneurs in China, that was the early days of the private sector, that the Chinese government leadership was not going to get in their way, that they should feel confident to take risks. And if they failed, it wasn't going to be because of the government. And this is something that I think Xi Jinping needs to do now, to restore confidence that if entrepreneurs hire and invest in their own business, that changes in the regulatory environment, like they've seen in recent years in property, in education, in gaming, in online platforms, that kind of regulatory volatility is over. And I think that will restore confidence. I think we're seeing the early stages of that with a meeting that was held last month between Xi Jinping and some of China's leading entrepreneurs, including one name that you might be familiar with, Jack Ma, the founder of Alibaba. He is now clearly back in the good graces of the leadership. We can see that not only with the meeting, but with the fact that during the Lunar New Year in January, Chinese TV's biggest show of the year is the holiday party for that. And in past years, Alibaba was the lead supporter, the lead advertiser on that show, but they were banished for several years, but they were back as the lead advertiser in January. And I think this is part of an effort on the part of Xi Jinping to try and restore confidence. I don't think he's done enough yet. Hopefully, we're going to see more of that in the next 10 days or so during the legislative session. But one point I want to leave you with you is when Chinese people feel that they have confidence again in government policy on the economy, on regulatory issues, there is a lot of cash sitting in Chinese bank accounts that they can use to invest in their own business, to hire for their own business, and to start spending again. Because remember, given that 90% of employment is in small entrepreneurial private companies, that means the average Chinese consumer is either an entrepreneur themselves or works for an entrepreneurial firm. The red bar on the left side of this chart shows you the net expansion in the size of Chinese household bank deposits since the beginning of COVID, the start of 2020. And these bank deposits include a lot of very small businesses who don't have a separate corporate bank account. These bank accounts increased by 90%. That is a net expansion, just the expansion, equal to about 10 trillion US dollars. And what this chart shows you, to put that in context, is that expansion in bank deposits is equal to more than double the size of Japan's GDP. So once confidence comes back, I think there's a lot of money or liquidity in the financial system in China that can be used to get domestic demand part of the story going again. And this will be the strongest response that the Chinese government can make to any tariffs coming from Washington. To wrap up, I just want to touch quickly on demographics issues, because this is something that comes up in a lot of my conversations with investors and companies and others. Clearly, China is facing demographic headwinds. But one of the misconceptions is that this was caused by the one-child policy, which was put in place decades ago. But what this chart shows you, if you look at the red line, that's the fertility rate for China, is the steepest decline in the fertility rate in China actually came before the one-child policy was put in place. And it's consistent with the decline in fertility rates that we've seen across Asia. So the one-child policy was a disaster for many reasons, but it's not the primary reason why China is facing these demographic headwinds. And then on the next slide, you can see that while China is getting older, this is a gradual, predictable process. And what this next slide shows you is that China is not going to be as old as Japan is today until about 2050. So that gives an opportunity for the Chinese government to take measures to try and mitigate the impact of this. And they're doing some of that now. You can see, for example, that China is spending a lot more money on education to help create a workforce that is better trained and better able to do higher value added jobs. They're spending more money on healthcare for older people. They're spending more on overall services for older people. Whether they succeed in preparing Chinese society for this kind of aging, it's too soon to tell. But this is a story that's going to play out over an extended period of time. So I'd like to stop here and turn it back over to our hosts and Yuan Ang, who I'm really looking forward to hearing from.
Thank you, Andy. And before I make an introduction to Dr. An, I just like to mention that Andy is an investment strategist for Matthews Asia, and he was principally responsible for developing research focused on China, ongoing economic and political developments. And he recently started his own firm called Sinology. And I apologize for not mentioning this at the start of Andy's presentation. So thank you so much. And now I would like to introduce Dr. An. And Dr. An is currently the Alfred Chandler Chair of Political Economy, Department of Political Science at Johns Hopkins University. And she will discuss with us today the two Gilded Age of the U.S. and China. Dr. An?
Hello, everyone. Thanks very much for having me, and I apologize for some technical difficulties in logging on, but I'm very glad it worked out, and I thank Andy very much for holding the stage. Well, thank you again for having me. It's a special privilege to participate in a teacher's workshop, knowing the impact that my teachers have had in my life long before I became a teacher myself. It's also a special privilege to share this panel with Andy and Clayton. Today, I'd like to introduce you to a resource that I believe will be helpful to teachers worldwide. This is the website of the Institute for New Economic Thinking, or INET. In addition to my own work, the Institute hosts a series of video lectures on work by many other scholars on timely topics on the economy, politics, international relations. And I had the pleasure of working with them to produce this featured series called The Economics of China. You can access this lecture series online, and it is entirely free. The series is based on my two books, How China Escaped the Poverty Trap and China's Gilded Age, and a more recent essay called The Clash of Two Gilded Ages. Now, normally people think of America and China as two cultural opposites that have nothing in common. As an editor of a major outlet once told me privately, China is often perceived as big, weird, and scary. Traditional media tends to reinforce that impression of China. And the reverse, simplistic negative portrayals of the US, is also true in China. This pattern has become worse as U.S.-China competition intensifies. In Western societies, anti-China sentiments can spill over into anti-Asian sentiment more broadly, as we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic. As educators, therefore, it is important to teach about U.S.-China relations in a humanizing way. And one way to do so, as I would like to suggest in my lecture series, is to explain Chinese political economy through the lens of American experiences, so that we are simultaneously aware of the political differences between the two societies, which are obvious, but also their similarities, which is perhaps less obvious. Despite their great power rivalry, America and China, I argue, are more similar than most people think. Both are living through a gilded age and struggling to end excesses of capitalism. I use the term Gilded Age, which should not be confused with the Golden Age. The term was coined by Mark Twain to describe American society in the late 19th century. That was a time when America was the world's largest emerging economy and the factory of the world. It was a time of rapid growth and industrialization that was also accompanied by gross inequality, corruption, and the rise of robber barons. Market reforms in the 1980s ushered in the first modern Chinese Gilded Age, whereas the US is arguably now living through a Gilded Age 2.0 that is built on high finance and big tech rather than oil and steel. Instead of a clash of civilizations, we are witnessing a curious form of great power competition, which I call the clash of two Gilded Ages. Now, before diving deeper into the clash of two Gilded Ages, because this is a teacher's workshop, let me walk you through some of the 7 episodes on the iNet series and the teaching resources that it offers. The first episode is about 3 Chinas. And as a teacher myself, I would always start my lectures by first differentiating between 3 very different Chinas. China under Mao, under Deng, and under Xi are not the same. It's as if China became 3 different countries. China under Mao was a planned economy. It was a closed society. China under Deng is known as the market reform era that completely transformed the country in about 40 years' time, whereas China under Xi is the China that we have seen since he took office in 2012. What I would describe from the lens of American history is that Deng's capitalist revolution delivered the first Chinese Gilded Age, whereas Xi inherited both the wealth and the problems of that age. And the first 10 years of his tenure, I'm going to call it the Red Progressive Platform, in the sense that he issued a series of socially progressive policies, but that were carried out through commands and campaigns combined with increased political control. As you can see in each of the lecture series, in addition to a 15 to 20-minute lecture, iNet has also provided an after-class resource, which includes a summary, as well as additional readings and shorter clips that you can take from these videos and use in your class. A second episode is about the political foundations underlying China's market reforms. The common impression is that China launched economic reforms without political reforms. And in this lecture, I explained that, in fact, that's not true. China did launch political reforms, except in the manner of bureaucratic reforms. And through these bureaucratic reforms, Deng Xiaoping injected the qualities of accountability, competition, and partial limits on power into a single-party autocracy. These bureaucratic changes, even though they seem dry, were very critical for the market reforms and adaptive style of development that we subsequently saw in China in the next 40 years, which takes us in the next lecture to the China model. The China model is often misunderstood to mean a master plan that leaders in Beijing had orchestrated in a boardroom. It's often thought of as top-down planning and authoritarian control. In fact, the China model is best understood as a hybrid of top-down direction and bottom-up improvisation by numerous local governments and entrepreneurs, such that if you look within China, across provinces, cities, and even counties and townships, you can find numerous China models within China itself. So I hope those 3 lectures can help dispel the stereotype of China as an unchanging monolith. In fact, China has transformed tremendously over time, and it also varies tremendously across space. The second part of the lecture then turns to China's Gilded Age. And in this lecture, I'm focused on why didn't corruption impede economic growth in China? Most people ask this question based on the assumption that in the Western experience, Western societies had first eradicated corruption as a precondition for economic growth. And what I'm going to show in this lecture is that, in fact, China was not that different from America when it was a developing country. At that time, during the American Gilded Age, it similarly saw rapid growth with corruption. But specifically, that corruption was in the manner of access money, elite exchanges of power and wealth that created speculative risk, inequality, but it was not corruption primarily in the forms of extortion and petty bribery. So the quality of corruption actually mattered a lot more than the perceived overall levels of corruption. That then takes me to the focus of today's sharing session, the clash of 2 Gilded Ages. And as you can watch the whole video series online, I'm not going to go through everything, but I'm just going to show you a few snapshots of the stories that I'm going to tell. This is a quote that I like to share. Yet for all the advances in material and cultural life, there remained a feeling that things had gone wrong. A screw had come loose, the wheels fallen off balance, prosperity was precarious as the recent crisis revealed, inequality was more obvious than ever, the capitalists controlled the government. This passage seems to be a fitting description of present-day China. In fact, it is a passage describing America's Gilded Age from 1865 to the 1900s. Oftentimes, when the dates and names in 19th century American history are removed, the parallels between that period and post-1980s China are striking, because both societies share a dramatic story of renewal after devastation and prosperity amid decadence. In the U.S., public backlash against the excesses of the Gilded Age triggered wide-ranging economic and social reforms through democratic activism that ushered in the progressive era, roughly 1890s to the 1920s. This domestic revolution, along with imperial acquisitions abroad, paved the way for America's rise as the superpower of the 20th century. China is currently passing through a similar, though not identical, phase. Now, make no mistake, China's growth has been nothing short of miraculous. The World Bank called it the fastest sustained expansion by a major economy in history. More than 800 million people have been lifted out of absolute poverty. After coming to power in 2012, during China's own Gilded Age, President Xi Jinping presides over a much wealthier economy, but he also must confront a host of new problems that comes with a middle-income, crony capitalist economy. And one of the most significant problems is corruption. At the time that Xi came to power, it coincided with one of the most dramatic corruption scandals in Chinese history, involving this man that you see on the screen, Bo Xilai, who was a princeling, that is the offspring of a political elite, and he was the party boss of Chongqing. And the incident highlighted to Xi the severity of corruption and its corrosion of the party's legitimacy. Along with cronyism came rising inequality. Since the 1980s, income inequality has risen faster in China than in the US. China's Gini coefficient, a standard measure of income inequality, exceeded America in 2012. And Chinese wealth inequality is even wider than income inequality because of those who accumulated assets during the early growth stages and who realized enormous gains. A third problem is systemic financial risk. In 2020, the finance ministry warned that local government debt was approaching 100% of all revenues combined. If local governments defaulted, the banks and financial institutions that loaned them these massive sums will be exposed and potentially set off a chain reaction. It is not just government finances that are in trouble. China's second largest property developer, Evergrande, has already gone bankrupt. These simmering crises should not be viewed in isolation. Rather, they are interconnected parts of China's Gilded Age. Corruption in the form of excess money spurred government officials to spur construction and investment aggressively, regardless of whether it was sustainable. Luxury properties that enriched colluding state and business elites have mushroomed across the country, while affordable housing remains in short supply. Those with political connections and wealth have easily reaped outsized profits through speculative investment. Therefore, if you think about this from the American perspective, you might say that if the American progressives at the turn of the 20th century were democratic skeptics of capitalism, then Xi is an authoritarian skeptic of capitalism. He sees his historic mission as summoning China out of the Gilded Age and into a red progressive era using the tools of Leninism, meaning commands and campaigns. For him, the end goal is not only to correct social inequality, but more importantly, to preserve the party's grip on power, even as China becomes more affluent and globalized. Upon taking office in 2012, Xi has in effect launched a platform of red progressivism, even though he did not use that term. This began with his anti-corruption drive, the largest in the party's history that is still ongoing, his poverty eradication campaign, and his common prosperity campaign in 2001, which included a crackdown on big private companies and rich celebrities. America's Gilded Age provides a historical lens for making sense of Xi's action. All crony capitalist economies, no matter how fast growing, eventually runs into limits. To say that America and China are similar, however, does not mean that they are identical, because obviously they're not. America is a democracy with constitutional protections of individual freedoms, whereas China is a top-down political system ruled by one party. Thus, the two countries are pursuing progressive reforms in very different ways. We might even say that within the US, President Biden and President Trump have pursued their visions of progressive reforms very differently. Whereas Biden pledges to build back better with big government spending and infrastructure projects and raising taxes on the rich, President Trump, on the other hand, has been drastically cutting down the size of the federal government while increasing tariffs. Ultimately, the contest between the US and China is not about who will sabotage and outrun the other. The greater crisis facing each country are mostly self-inflicted. So if there is a race, I would argue that whichever nation, quotes unquote, wins is the one who avoids self-inflicted wounds and makes capitalism work for the common good rather than for a small sliver of super elites. Well, thank you very much again to the teachers in the audience for your service, and I look forward to our interactions.
Thank you, Dr. An. It's a great presentation. At this point, I would also like to introduce and welcome Clay Dubie, who is not a stranger to the 1990 Institute. Clay recently retired as the director of U.S.-China Institute, and he will continue to be involved with USCI as a member of its executive committee and as a senior fellow. We are so fortunate and lucky to welcome Clay back to help lead this conversation with Dr. Yuanyuan An and Andy Rothman and moderate the questions from our audience. Clay?
Grace, thank you so much for your kind remarks. But more to the point, thanks to the entire 1990 Institute for bringing this together. This is a remarkable opportunity to learn from some big thinkers, people with serious expertise on China's economy and the interplay between the politics and the economics. And what's interesting, of course, is the comparison that we get from Yuanyuan's work on this comparison of two Gilded Ages and this clash there that follows. But I'd like to begin, and we have space for you to ask questions. Use the Q&A button and go ahead and type your question in. We also got a few questions ahead of time, and we'll try to mix them in and use our time as well as possible. I'd like to begin. There's a great deal of emphasis in Yuanyuan's point about policy, the policy platforms, these kinds of things. And Andy emphasized the role of the private sector, but highlighted how government intervention in 2020 to try to address the property issues, and that led to a number of problems. There, of course, were policy issues connected to dealing with COVID and all of those kinds of things. But I'd like to begin with a question about the state, about this state. Now, the data that we've been tossing around has been primarily about development and more recent development. But what role is there for the state? It seems to be decisive, and it is still a Leninist party, and you still have Leninist policy. And Yuanyuan talked about this top-down red progressivism and things like that. So if each of you could talk about, in 2025, is the state marching faster? Is it marching into new terrain? Or is it backing off? Andy drew a comparison with 1992 and Deng Xiaoping's Southern tour. Is the state backing off? Where are we in 2025? And Andy spoke first earlier. Maybe we'll let Yuanyuan open this time, and then we'll go to Andy.
Great. Thank you very much, Clay. You've started with the $1 trillion question in Chinese politics. In China, the state, and in particular the party, which is inseparable from the state, is all-powerful and ubiquitous. There is no question about that. And even during the market reform period, it wasn't that the state disappeared or withdrew or even retreated. It's only that the state changed its relationship with the market. Right? It changed its policy towards globalization and the private sector. But make no mistake that the state is always an all-dominant entity in the Chinese political system. But I think one important clarification to make is that when outside observers think about China as a one-party state, it imagines that China is still a traditional command economy, like in a Maoist style, where the great leader says, do X, and everyone does X, right? That everything runs by commands, and it's carried out in exactly the way he wants. The great complexity during the market reform period is that even though you always had this all-powerful state, that centralized political system was at the same time combined with tremendous administrative and economic decentralization. That combination of top down and bottom up was what made China work. Right. So most people see the top-down elements and they have much less appreciation for the bottom-up elements. So I would emphasize an understanding of how the top and the bottom work together. And this relationship between top and bottom changed when we entered the Xi Jinping era, where again he tried to renegotiate both the power balance between central and local governments, as well as between the government and the private sector. And what we often see is something like the pendulum going back and forth. So I mentioned the Common Prosperity Campaign in 2021-ish, where it seemed that the party was obviously taking back power from the private sector, which were perceived to have become too powerful and even a force of decadence. So we see this reining in of the private sector accesses. But more recently, including at the meetings held just 2 weeks ago, within the last 2 weeks, again, you see Xi Jinping pushing the pendulum back in the other direction, where he says, no, we very, very much welcome the private sector. We need you for our economy. So within this overall framework, where the party always dominates, you see the pendulum moving, back and forth within these parameters.
No, that's great. Thank you. And, Andy was on the scene, as was I, when that decentralization that you spoke of. And so as I turn to Andy, one of the things that happened during this Deng era was not just that he made the tour, asserting that reform is going to continue, but that on the ground, policies existed to continue to nurture that. And those who wanted to move to a more command situation were not able to do that. The meeting, Ma meets Xi, and that particular meeting, that sends an important signal, because it's broadcast everywhere. Everybody sees it. And so it definitely sets a different tone. But what's happening? Is anything happening administratively to try to encourage some of those folks to reach into their bank accounts, because you highlighted the tremendous resources there, and put it to work in their own businesses?
Great questions. And that was just a beautiful answer to your initial question from Yuan. So let me just highlight a couple of elements of what I think Yuan was trying to get across to answer your question and elaborate a little bit on that. This is clearly a Leninist system, but we have to distinguish between the Leninist system of political control versus moving, as Yuan said, to a more market system. This is, I think, a unique experiment in global history, to have a Leninist political system moving increasingly to more personal freedom for individuals and also for more market-driven economics. We've never seen this before. And in the early days of it, not a lot of people paid attention to it because it was on a relatively small scale. So we didn't care, or we only cared when it seemed to be all positive. And now it's more complicated simply because China has become so big. And I also agree with Yuan's comments about the pendulum. We saw the pendulum swing way too far in one direction. Now it is starting to swing back in the other direction. Clay, you highlighted the meeting that I mentioned before between Xi Jinping and some of the entrepreneurs, including Jack Ma. I think that was his effort to start moving the pendulum back in a direction that's going to be more supportive for the private sector. And this gets me to what I think is a really important fundamental question right now for all of us observing China. Is the pendulum swinging too far in the other direction over the last several years the result of an ideological change on the part of Xi Jinping, that he now believes that the private sector no longer has an important role in China, that the private companies should be reduced relative to state-owned enterprises, that all of a sudden he's changed and he wants those guys to go away. Because if you believe that, then it's hard to be optimistic about the pendulum swinging back in the other direction. Personally, I don't see this as ideological. And there's a few reasons for that. One is Xi himself has been supportive of the private sector for a very long time. In fact, his father, as both of you know, Xi Jinping, was a key player in the early market-oriented reforms in Guangdong under Deng Xiaoping in the late 1970s. Xi Jinping himself rose up through the party in some of the most entrepreneurial parts of China. But maybe more importantly, I think Xi Jinping understands that all of the net new job creation in China comes from small private companies today. All of the wealth creation, all of the innovation. He always talks about things like his phrase, new productive forces. He's talking about battery makers, EVs, AI. Almost all of those companies are private. So it doesn't make any sense to me that he's now decided that he deliberately wants to collapse that part of the economy. When I read his speeches about common prosperity that Yuan referred to, I hear echoes of FDR and his New Deal. I hear echoes of Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society. I think what Xi Jinping has been trying to do is fix some of the same socioeconomic problems that we're all wrestling with in our countries. Rising inequality that Yuan referred to, unequal access to housing, to healthcare, to education. I just think he went about it in a really clumsy, poorly executed way. And now the pendulum has to swing back to deal with those real problems, but in a way that's constructive and supports the growth of the private sector again.
Thank you. And one big question, and then I'd like to turn to more specific questions for each of you. And this is the role of the external world. And both of you touched on this, that in fact, China's rise has been good for the United States and could continue to be good for the United States. They're certainly losers, but consumers and companies that sell to China, including big ones on the Pacific Coast, companies like Boeing, California is a big exporter. All of these companies have benefited from that. Let's talk for a second, though, about Xi Jinping's signature foreign policy initiative, the Belt and Road Initiative, where you have state-owned companies that are often leading the way with some of the big construction projects, superhighways, high-speed rail, ports, telecommunications infrastructure, this kind of thing. But you have a whole slew of private entrepreneurs who are part of that too. Now, for a variety of reasons, the Belt and Road Initiative is not on the front page of the newspaper in China these days. But maybe you could say something about the opportunity that China sees with Central Asia, with Southeast Asia, and Latin America, Africa. And maybe, Andy, you could go ahead and open the response this time, and then we'll go to Yan.
Sure. I look at the Belt and Road project or policy as something analogous to the Marshall Plan that the U.S. put in place at the end of World War II, where it was not completely selfless. It was designed to support growth in economies that had been weakened by war, but also with the subtext of it was going to create new markets for American exporters. And I think the Chinese are trying to do the same thing. They're trying to build up infrastructure to support growth in economies and also support countries that have resources, say iron ore, that can get to market and which will not necessarily go directly to China, but go into global markets and reduce prices for everybody who's importing iron ore, for example. And I do think that you're right that while the big state-owned enterprises get all the headlines, smaller companies have been participating in this, just like smaller companies, private companies in China participated in a lot of the infrastructure development during the stimulus in response to the global financial crisis. One thing I'll just leave you with is that I showed a chart earlier about how China's exports have shifted away from the G7 developed countries. The fastest growing markets for Chinese exports have been the BRICS countries, or the Belt and Road countries. And the majority of Chinese exports now come from small private companies, not from state-owned enterprises. So I think that these policies from the top down have been grabbed carefully and successfly by entrepreneurial private companies in China.
For turning our attention from internal to external, the China's Belt and Road Initiative and its increased investment and trade can be seen from a broader perspective as the shift in global patterns from north-south to south-south, right? So outside of even if you take out the Belt and Road Initiative in general, what happened in the past is that poor countries in the south, like China, would manufacture low-end goods and then they sell it to the global north. And through this export-led mass industrialization, achieve economic growth. That was the old model. And what we are seeing today, as Andy very correctly pointed out, is this shift toward South-South trade. So there's more trade happening between what used to be called developing countries and less so in the North-South direction. So that's sort of the broader context in which we can understand the Belt and Road. But on the point of the BRI, I think it is also a good opportunity to correct one common stereotype about Chinese foreign policy. There's a tendency to think that everything that China does is a coherent, finely orchestrated master plan meant to undermine the United States. Right? So the Belt and Road just very nicely fit into that narrative. And even when things go wrong with the Belt and Road, which we see in many cases, analysts then work backward and argue that China is deliberately trying to make mistakes on the ground in order to make other countries fall into a debt trap. Right? So everything is deliberate and intentional and strategic. In fact, the Belt and Road Initiative is a good example where the domestic model of directed improvisation, so top down plus bottom up, is being exported overseas. And you see elements of directed improvisation very clearly in the BRI. The top down directions were surprisingly thin. So if you read one of the opening documents from the top, that initiated this whole, I think it's a multi-billion dollar initiative. It was only 7 pages long in font 14, right? Written in vague sort of slogan-like language, very lacking in specifics. And it almost has the tone of, why don't you guys just go out to the world and try, and then we'll see what breaks and we'll figure out what to do. Right? That was basically the tone. But as soon as Xi Jinping said, that is our signature foreign policy, it had a mobilization effect, right? And everyone, not just state-owned enterprises, but even private enterprises, even universities, everyone wanted to join the bandwagon of the Belt and Road. And along the way, it indeed made a lot of mistakes, broke a lot of things, got China into some debt situations that China, in fact, did not want to be in. And it learned along the way. So when we look at the BRI now, what we see is a much more humble version, something that is much more realistic, is much more toned down, in line with China's own domestic challenges, rather than the grand hubristic vision that was put out in 2013. So instead of stereotyping everything that comes out of China as a strategic master plan, just know that the brightest leaders in Beijing are as human as everyone else. They have limited information. They sometimes overextend. They are more ambitious than circumstances allow them to. And in fact, they make mistakes and learn and adjust all the time.
Now, this is an excellent point and a great caution for all of us, but especially for those who are introducing China to students who may not be that familiar with this, to be very clear that often there is no plan beyond an idea. And that was very much the case in 1978 with Deng Xiaoping's reforms, and they stumbled along and found ways, and some things worked, some things didn't. And we see that now with the Belt and Road, which was marketing at the outset, taking policies to encourage companies to leave the boundaries of China. And then let's call it the Belt and Road Initiative. So everybody has a name for it. We can include it in all the 5-year plans. We can move forward in this way. But it conceals so much because, as you suggest, there's all sorts of space that needs to be filled in. And the Chinese party state often lets folks find a way to fill it in. And then if they don't like the direction that's going, they come down and come down hard. But otherwise, if it works, take credit for it. Take credit for it. So I think that's a useful point for us to keep in mind, is that not everything has this master plan where all the details about what might be happening in Sri Lanka is worked out, in Beijing long ahead of time. So a lot of different actors. And one of the striking things that Andy has emphasized is the multiple actors at work in China. And Yuan Yan's book brings this home. And you compare Mr. Fu, who is our Leland Stanford, compare him to people like Bo Xilai, who combine wealth and power and these kinds of things. And so maybe we could say something. It didn't come up in Andy's discussion, but it definitely comes up in Yuan Yan. It's the subject of her book, where she's come up with an entirely new way of looking at the question of corruption and development. What's going on? Has this massive effort to bring in the tigers and to squash flies and others, this big anti-corruption effort, how has it changed how things work? In the sense of the access capital question, or access capital question that Yuan Yan uses in her book to talk about buying it at the top level. And then, Andy, you work with these companies. You see how they function, how they've grown. Have things changed? And maybe, Yuan Yan, you should open this one.
Oh, thank you very much for your generous mention. Xi's anti-corruption campaign should be seen in broader light. I think people tend to fixate on the campaign, on who he arrests, and less on what is the context in which that was introduced. And one way to think about it is, as I emphasize, the anti-corruption is part of his progressive image and platform. And I understand that some Americans might feel offended at even the use of progressive. How could that word be used in China? But from Xi's perspective, he sees that he is the inheritor, of the problems of capitalism, and the way to build his legacy and to enforce his power is to say, I'm the guy who can keep the benefits of capitalism while taking away its problems, including corruption. Right? So it's part of his progressive platform. Over time, I also would say that his anti-corruption drive is also part of a broader effort to reduce bureaucratic autonomy. Right? And I know that's kind of a less obvious concept, but even though China is a politically centralized system, it had over time built up a technocratic bureaucracy. Right? It had quite an able and competent bureaucracy. And these bureaucrats may often have their own agendas or expertise or knowledge, and they may not always be carrying out the ideological goals of the great leader. Right? So having the anti-corruption campaign is not only a way to tame his enemies, to get obedience, but also to squash bureaucratic autonomy. And if you now look at the situation in the US, you'll find that perhaps that's not totally effort at limiting bureaucratic autonomy that has been a very central facet, right, of US democracy. We usually think of US democracy only in terms of elections, right, freedom of speech, and we sort of take bureaucratic autonomy and expertise for granted, right? But once that pillar is taken away, we realize that, oh, in fact, bureaucratic autonomy and expertise was also a really key pillar of democracy. So in a kind of parallel, strangely parallel way, what's also happening in China is that anti-corruption has to be seen in a broader context, both as a way of, both as a pillar of Xi's progressive image, but also as a way for him to limit bureaucratic autonomy so that the bureaucracy will always obediently implement all of his signature policies, from anti-poverty to the Belt and Road.
And he wants to set priorities and see those adhered to. Please, Andy, has doing business changed? People spoke of making it when the anti-corruption program was launched in 2013, 2014, that it shut down a lot of decision making. What has been your observation?
I think it's useful to break down the impact of the anti-corruption campaign in that sense on bureaucrats and on business people. I think it did have a fairly dramatic impact on many officials because the anti-corruption campaign was targeted against them. And so you did run into the problem where many officials just felt, the safest thing for me to do is not do anything because then I can't be accused of having my hand out. And so there was a period of time where that had an impact, but I don't think it's that important because for most businesses in China, they just want to have a stable, predictable, transparent regulatory environment. So what I'm hearing from Chinese entrepreneurs is the same thing that I'm hearing from American entrepreneurs today. What is going to happen in the next 6 months and 6 years in terms of tariffs, in terms of regulations on workplace safety, or everything that involves my business? Because in a period of high levels of uncertainty, how much do I want to invest in my own business? How much do I want to hire? And so it's interesting that while we're in this period of regulatory turmoil, and when I say regulatory, I'm including the tariffs, I'm hearing the same complaints from American businesses that I'm hearing for the last 3 years from Chinese business people. They are not saying I'm in favor of corruption. They're not. And I think it's important, as I think Yuan makes clear in her books and her articles, and I highly recommend those. She's just a fantastic writer on these subjects. There's different kinds of corruption, right? I mean, I lived for a couple of years as a diplomat in Indonesia, and there you had a kind of corruption that gummed up the works. You had to pay bribes to do everything, to get a phone installed in your shop. That really held back job creation and economic growth in Indonesia. But in China, you generally don't have to do that. The corruption is a different kind of corruption. It's, I guess, access corruption would be maybe the phrase that UN would use. And it means a handful of people getting very, very rich through corruption at the top levels of the government or even middle levels of the government. But it hasn't gotten in the way of, for example, per capita household income growing by 500% over the last couple of decades in China. What they're looking for, again, to sum up, is the same thing that Americans are looking for. Just tell me what the environment is going to be so it's transparent and it's not chaotic, so I can plan.
Okay, so everybody would appreciate knowing that whatever it is, I can work towards that. One of the questions that came up, and we're going to have to wrap up, but one of the questions that was raised among the attendees had to do with innovation and how China can move forward. Now, Andy highlighted some high-tech companies at the very outset and compared the DeepSeek, the news about DeepSeek, being able to do a lot of things for much less, on the basis of less investment and less less energy needs and all of these other kinds of things, comparing that to a Sputnik moment for Silicon Valley. And Andy also made reference to the response that the U.S. made to Sputnik in terms of investing. You highlighted science and tech, but the U.S. government also invested in language, historical studies, learning about the wider world. And so I'd like to end our portion of this by coming back to something that Yuan highlighted, that so many of the problems that we have are self-inflicted. And rather than jumping to point the finger at the other superpower, perhaps we need to look at ourselves and to reform in various ways. If you only have 30 seconds, which is about what you'll have, what should the priorities be for these two countries? Andy has already put, let's clarify with the direction we're going on the table. But what else? Yan, let's start with you.
My gosh, you're giving me a $1 trillion question in 30 seconds.
Yeah,
I would
probably a $20 trillion question, but yeah.
That's right. Well, I think, first of all, damage control, really. Before you can even attempt to do good, first try not to do harm. And I think China has come to that realization. So you do see various course corrections, like trying to win back the confidence of the private sector that was shattered by earlier actions. So a lot of damage control being done. The critical challenge in China today is how can China transition from an old investment real estate driven economy to a new economy? And I would say one of the key challenges in this transition is that the Chinese government can't just throw away the old economy and put all their chips in the new one, because the vast majority of Chinese people are employed in the old economy. Right? So that's something that I think they haven't quite worked out yet, because the top leader has put all of his chips in the new economy. Now, in the U.S., I would say, wow, there's so much going on as I can barely follow the breaking news, right? But just to follow up on what you said about innovation, right? The U.S. has always led in basic sciences, tech, and innovation. And the core of that is, of course, our universities, right? U.S. universities are by a very large margin leaders in the world. So I feel like I'm almost saying that in a kind of impartial way, since I work in a university, but it is true that if our universities are not enabled to do the research that they have always been doing, then you're not going to get scientific innovation, period. I mean, companies take what researchers develop and commercialize them, but ultimately the sources of the science and the innovation comes from the universities. So if the US really wants to compete with China, then in the least, it shouldn't be using a sledgehammer on the sources of innovation in this country.
Thank you. And now we turn to Andy. This is, of course, this giant question, and we can't really heal both countries in a matter of moments, but do your best.
Okay, maybe I'll sum up with 2 points. One is, it is clear that the United States and China are going to be engaged for a very long time in competition. But we believe here in the United States that competition is good. Whether it's in academia, in science, in business, it drives everybody to do better. And I think there is no evidence that the leadership of the Chinese government is focused right now on destroying America or destroying the global system that we've built. China has gotten rich, and the Communist Party has stayed in power longer than any other authoritarian regime in history by playing in this system. Now, sometimes they game the rules to their advantage. We need to push back. We need to stay active in those. But I think we need to look at the competition with China as something that's healthy for us, and that we need to understand that there'll be areas where we will not agree on everything with China. But I think for the most part, we can find constructive ways to solve problems and we need to be focused on that. And that requires, as Yuan said, investing in our own future. So not trying to say we're going to put tariffs on China at the same time we're cutting funding for education, for childcare, for research, for basic R&D in the United States. The best way to compete with China is to make sure that our future students are going to be equipped for that world. And then the last point I'll make is I think it's really important, and I'm really biased here because this is how I've come to focus on China for the last 40 years. It's really important that students have an opportunity to learn about China, to understand that Chinese people really want the same things that we want. And so I think it's really important for kids in the US to have the opportunity that I had as a college student to go and just spend some time in China and to learn that if I showed up like Clay did at the Wham concert 40 years ago in China, that the kids in the audience were behaving just like kids at a Wham concert in the UK.
That's a great summation, because basically, Andy, what you've said is we need everybody who is participating today. All the people who have carved out time from very hectic schedules to spend this time to learn about the Chinese economy, past and present, drawing comparisons to the United States, highlighting the similarities and the differences. This is really vital. And we need everyone to keep opening these windows for our students, trying to get more and more students learning about China, learning Chinese, traveling, doing all of these kinds of things, because we are joined, and our future will be joined. We may not always like this, but we are in this together. And so that's definitely true on the Chinese side too. We need both countries to be more open-minded and better informed about the other. So thanks to 1990 for bringing this all together. And I think it's my job now to turn it back to Grace. We really do appreciate what all of the folks who are joined with us today try to do to foster a better relationship through deeper understanding.
Thank you. I personally learned a lot today, and I think the discussion opened my thinking about corruptions and bureaucracies and economic development in a different light, and also see that in many ways that the U.S. economies in its development and in the Chinese economy has certain similarities, maybe to quote a old saying, in different characteristics, the American characteristics and the Chinese characteristics. But nonetheless, the fact that both economies are linked at the hips, and that movements or activities on one side does impact the other side and also ripples through the global economy at large. So thank you very much for Dr. An and Andy Rothman for bringing some very interesting perspectives to the discussions. And Clay, thank you as always. Excellent moderations and leading the discussions and getting the questions from the audience to our speakers. Many, many thanks. With this, I would like to close this workshop. But before I go, I just wanted to say thank you and to our participants for spending the time to join us. And I hope this conversation tonight spark some new ideas and deeper understandings and allow you to take interesting discussions into the classroom for your students. And like Andy said, that understanding China is a must for our future youth. And this is what 1990 set out to do and has been a core mission for our organization. So really, really, the discussion kind of reaffirms what 1990 Institute tried to do. And what you are seeing on the slides are some resources that are for teachers and really also for general audience, lifelong learners, for people who are curious about China and U.S.-China relations. So I hope that you do come and visit these sites that we provide, and hope that you gain some more insight into the topics that we focus on. We also are planning a in-person activities later this year that bring together youth, educators, and parents in the San Francisco Bay Area. And the event is scheduled for September 6th. So please, if you're not on our email newsletter distributions, please sign up. And the QR code is for your convenience to get to our site. I hope to see you at our next workshop. And thank you again for attending. Good night.